here for. So before we do, we wanted to share a few announcements, and then we will invite our guest. So I'd like to invite Sharon Kahn to share some announcements and introduce our speaker.
Moadim L'Simcha, Happy Sukkot. Join us for our Simchat Torah services tomorrow, Wednesday evening at 6:30, and on Thursday morning at the Yizkor service at 10 a.m. And then join us Tuesday, November 5th at 1 p.m. for the next Kibbutz and cookies, conversation, games, or whatever. There will be snacks, coffee and tea, and games available, as well as a hot topics conversation led by Bruce Howitt. The next Lunch and Learn will be November 19th with Rabbi Lawrence Hoffman, who is a world-renowned scholar and professor of liturgy who taught for decades at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. So look for information and registration to come soon. Those are the announcements which Cantor Cohn gave me on a piece of paper. And when I arrived, she thanked me for months ago, maybe last year, suggesting George Bluman as a speaker here. And then she said, do you want to introduce George? So I said, sure, give me the piece of paper and I'll read it. She said, there is no paper. So I'm going to tell you what I know about George, who I've known for many, many years. When I was at UBC, George was the head of the math department. He was Mr. Mathematics at UBC, and I've since learned from him that he has done over 200 math workshops in elementary and high schools for students. So Mr. Mathematics in the province and vice president of the Canadian Mathematical Society and the winner of their highest education award, the Innovation Award. So he comes with very good math credentials, and if any of you want to hear about math, his specialty right now, symmetry and differential equations. But that's for another talk, and I don't necessarily recommend it for Lunch and Learn. Now, I know something about his Temple Sholom credentials, and I'll say a few words about those. I remember his mother of blessed memory, Susan, who was a member at Temple Sholom for many years. And I also have seen George in recent months at the Sisterhood's Sunday morning walks. So he's around, and today he's going to talk to us more about how his mother, his father came to BC, to Vancouver, and maybe to Temple Sholom. So please join me in a very warm welcome for George Bluman.
Thank you very much, Sharon. And it's my mother was for many years a member and a very proud member of this congregation. Now, it is my honor to speak today about the heroic Japanese diplomat Chiune Sugihara, his legacy, and my family's ongoing connections with the Sugihara family. In 1940, Sugihara was a Japanese vice consul in Lithuania, and against advice from his superiors in Tokyo, he issued transit visas to Japan that ended up saving 2,100 Jewish refugees who otherwise would have been likely murdered. And about 15% of those saved eventually came to Canada. And perhaps as many as 40,000 people owe their lives due to the extraordinary deeds of Sugihara, including 25 in my family. My parents, Nathan and Susan Bluman, their 3 children, 8 grandchildren, 10 great-grandchildren, and an uncle and aunt. Now, what led to Sugihara's actions? After the Nazi invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939, Poland was divided into German and Russian zones. I'll use the word Russian rather than Soviet. Vilna, Poland, was in the Russian zone, and in October 1939 was transferred from Poland to neutral Lithuania. For this reason, until the border was closed in March 1940, about 20,000 risk-taking Polish Jews fled to Vilna, today called Vilnius. And from Warsaw, my parents fled to Vilna, arriving in February 1940. So here in this map, here's Warsaw, right here on the map. And then when my parents, they were not married actually when this whole journey started. They went from Warsaw to, my father went to Lviv, or Lvov in Poland. It was part of Poland at that time. And from there, they went to Vilnius, which had become part of Lithuania. And it was known as Vilna in Poland. Okay. And also, I want to point out, the capital of Lithuania at that time was Kaunas, over here. Okay. Now, in mid-June 1940, the Russians occupied Lithuania, and in early August, Lithuania was annexed to the Soviet Union. And at that time, Kaunas was the capital, as I mentioned, and after annexation, all consulates had to close within 4 weeks, including the Japanese consulate run by Chiune Sugihara. Now, 2 diplomats from Holland played crucial roles in Sugihara's heroics. After the Nazi occupation of Holland in May 1940, an anti-Nazi Dutch government in exile was established in London, which remained in charge of all Dutch embassies. The anti-Nazi Dutch ambassador in Latvia, De Decker, dismissed his pro-Nazi Lithuanian honorary council. He was replaced by Jan Zwartendijk, a Dutch engineer heading Philips Electronics in Kaunas. Now, 2 Dutch rabbinical students approached Zwartendijk requesting documentation to go to Curaçao, a Dutch colony in the West Indies, with the aim of traveling east through Russia, Japan, the Pacific Ocean, and the Panama Canal to tiny Curaçao, an island off the coast of Venezuela, about 1/6 the size of Metro Vancouver. And they also sought permits for their mostly Polish classmates in the rabbinical school. But why Curaçao? Because no visa was required to enter Curaçao. But the local governor had sole authority to permit entry, but this was rarely granted. Now, Zwartendijk was given permission by Dedeker to issue permits to Curaçao to their fellow students that stated in French, a visa for entry is not required, leaving out the condition of the governor's permission. Moreover, Zwartendijk courageously agreed to issue such permits to all Jewish refugees who applied for them. So here's the pages from the visa of Jakubowicz. In fact, I'm in correspondence. He's a professor of history in the University of Sydney. And anyhow, his number 1896 of the permits given by Zwartendijk. Here is Zwartendijk's signature over here. It's hard to, here it is right here, Zwartendijk's signature. And this is 31st of July, 1940. And this is what it says in French. Now, Now, a Jewish refugee delegation approached Chiune Sugihara about obtaining Japanese transit visas, a necessary step for the fake scheme. Without approval from Tokyo, and after getting Russian permission, signed by, believe it or not, Joseph Stalin, for refugee transit through Russia, Sugihara issued transit visas valid for a stay of 10 days in Japan based on the seemingly sufficient Zwartendijk Curaçao permits. And Zwartendijk signed about 2,300 such permits until his office was forced to close very early on the day that Lithuania was annexed by the Soviet Union because the workers revolted against him, so he had to close down earlier. An estimated half of those receiving Zwartendijk permits obtained Sugihara transit visas, and the scam worked. Initially, Sugihara issued handwritten transit visas to all who requested them with Zwartendijk permits. 3 days later, he had 2 rubber stamps made for all issued visas, one in English and French, and the other in Japanese. Now, Zwartendijk returned to occupied Holland and said nothing about what he had done, since his family would otherwise be in grave danger. Sugihara was able to stay on for a further 4 weeks to continue writing transit visas. And 3 times Sugihara cabled Tokyo, and each time was not encouraged to issue transit visas for the Curaçao travelers. In his memoirs, Sugihara modestly noted that he did not actually need permission from Tokyo to issue the transit visas. Furthermore, seeing all the desperate refugees with nowhere else to turn for help, Chiune Sugihara unbelievably decided on his own, after Zwartendijk's departure, to issue transit visas with the same rubber stamps to Jews who had no Zwartendijk permits. An estimated half of those receiving Sugihara transit visa had no Zwartendijk permits, and such Jews included my parents, who approached Sugihara's office 6 days after Zwartendijk had left. Okay, so here is this is a very famous, my parents' visa is very famous. In fact, if you look, it's on Wikipedia. It's listed as an example of a visa. And on this passport, so here are 2 stamps by Sugihara, one in English, one in Japanese. This is the stamp when they arrived in Japan, in Suruga, Japan. And this stamp indicates actually they could stay for 30 days. Now, so this is all stamps. The right-hand side of this visa is in fact handwritten by a Japanese official when my parents arrived in Suruga, Japan. And basically it was to try to ease their stay, ease their being able to come to Japan. So Japanese officials played an important role besides Sugihara. This is an example of that. With their life-saving Sugihara transit visa, my parents obtained a Russian exit permit, and they traveled to Moscow, stayed there a few days, and then took the Trans-Siberian Express on a 12-day journey to Vladivostok, followed by a harrowing 48-hour boat ride to Suruga, Japan, and then went by train to Kobe, arriving in early February 1941. So here is the route. They're starting in, there's Kaunas, Moscow, and the Trans-Siberian Railroad to Vladivostok, and here's Suruga. And this, by the way, was the main way for a long time that Japanese people went to Europe. This was the route, including the emperor. About 80% of the Jewish refugees issued Sugihara visas survived. And about 3/4 of them arrived in Japan. And almost half ended up in Shanghai. And about 1/4 were associated with rabbinical schools. Only about 10% of the Polish Jewish refugees in Vilna seized the opportunity to obtain a Sugihara visa. The remainder were murdered after the Nazis seized Lithuania in June 1941, except for those fortunate to get British permission to go to Palestine. Now I want to tell you more about Chiune Sugihara. He was born on January 1st, 1900, in the remote village of Yautsu, famous for its rice paddies. In fact, it won an award a few years ago for that. In 1919, 19 years old, he went to Harbin, China. He studied many foreign languages, especially German and Russian, and became a rising star in the Japanese foreign ministry. He converted to Christianity and married a Russian woman. More than 15 years later, they divorced in 1935. And Chiune resigned his post and returned to Japan, apparently in protest of the Japanese military's brutal behavior toward Chinese civilians. He married Yukiko, 13 years his junior, and in 1937, he was posted to Helsinki, Finland. They left for Helsinki by boat from Yokohama, landing in Vancouver on August the 30th, 1937, before arriving in Seattle to travel by train to the US East Coast, finally by boat to Helsinki. But Vancouver was the first stop on Sugihara's fateful trip that led to saving so many Jews. So here is a copy of Chiune Sugihara's passport. And the first entry is getting a diplomatic visa to Canada on August 6, 1937 in Tokyo. And that's a picture of Chiune Sugihara, of course. And here is the entry in Vancouver, August the 20th, August 30th, 1937. On the previous page you see for Seattle, August 30th. The next day he was in Seattle. It's an interesting story about why this was the order and why this order changed. For a long time the boats went to Vancouver and then Seattle, and then it changed to Seattle, Vancouver. Also, note a trip to Poland in 1938 here. Oops. Yes. No. Okay. While he was in Helsinki, the Japanese government decided to open a new consulate. They'd never previously had any consulate in Kaunas, Lithuania, the first time they had in Lithuania, with Sugihara as vice consul, reporting to the ambassadors in Riga and Berlin, as well as the Japanese foreign minister Matsuoka, who had known Sugihara in Harbin. And that did play an important role. In reality, Sugihara's primary responsibility was to spy on Russian and German movements, for which he employed 2 Poles and a German. Chiune Sugihara arrived in Kaunas 5 days after the infamous Russian-Nazi pact, or the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and 4 days before the Nazi invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. Before his heroic activities 11 months later, Chiune, his wife Yukiko, their 3 young sons, and Yukiko's sister Setsuko lived a comfortable life in Kaunas amidst his supposed diplomatic activities. As I say, he was a spy. All was knowingly at risk for him and his family when he defiantly issued the life-saving visas. He expected repercussions at the end of the war, if not sooner. In early September 1940, Chiune and his family left Kaunas for Berlin, followed by postings in Prague, Königsberg, and Bucharest. So this is the last pages of Sugihara's passport. And here you see he's going September 2nd, he got this diplomatic visa. Oh, okay. He got this diplomatic visa to go to Berlin. So now in Prague, Matsuoka requested a list of all the people he'd given the visas to. So to Foreign Minister Matsuoka, he forwarded the now famous Sugihara list, containing 2,100 distinct names, of which about 90% were Polish Jews. So here is the list. It was done in English, basically, not only English, but different languages. And these are the date in which the visa was given, the amount you paid for the visa, and his nationality, etc. This is the first page. And my uncle, who I knew as Lolik, and his wife, Danka, or Danuta La Paz, they got visas number 515 and 516 on July 31st. So they had Zartend permits. They would have had, on August the 9th, my parents got their visa number 1569. Now, when my mother went to, my father had a passport. I'm showing you pages from his passport. My father had a passport because he had been in the United States for a year before the war broke out. And my mother, she had no documents at all when she went into Lithuania. So before they could get a visa from Sugihara, she had to be added to my father's passport. Now, Poland did not have a consulate in Lithuania, and the reason really was because Poland was very upset that parts of Lithuania had been given over, parts of Poland had been given over to Lithuania. And so the brother was added to my father's passport the day before at the British consulate, the day before they saw Sugihara. Now, in Bucharest, Sugihara's family was later imprisoned by the Russians in a POW camp for 18 months. Now, back in Japan in 1947, Chiune was dismissed from diplomatic service. And in 1960, he went to work for a Japanese trading company in Moscow for 16 years, alone, except for an annual visit to Tokyo to see his family. In 1968 now, Chiune learned that most of the Jews he helped actually survived. And in 1985, Chiune Sugihara was recognized by the State of Israel, receiving the Righteous Among the Nations Award from Yad Vashem. And Jan Zwartendijk was so honored 12 years later. And moreover, Chiune Sugihara and his descendants were given perpetual Israeli citizenship. Now, further on my parents' story. When in Kobe, my father traveled frequently to Tokyo. The fast trains in Japan helped a lot. And he was seeking a country to take them in. By accident, he met a former professor of his in Warsaw, who was also on the Sugihara list, who told him to go to the Polish embassy. The Polish ambassador, Tadeusz Romer, played a prominent part in the Sugihara story. In particular, he successfully pressured Canada, Australia, Burma, the United States, and Latin American countries to issue permits for the admission of almost 600 Polish Jewish refugees for the duration of the war. And thanks to Romer, my parents, and 17 other future Vancouverites were among the fortunate few to obtain such a permit to Canada for the duration of the war. So here is, they obtained this Canadian visa in the Polish embassy. And what it says on there, it says, this is my father and my mother, and this is temporary for the entry, temporary for the duration of the war, temporary entry for the duration of the war. So they were below refugee status. That means they had to go back to Poland after the war. And now, the professor, my father's professor, when he met him in Tokyo, said there were 25 visas available to Canada for professional people. And my father had a degree in agricultural engineering. And so he went there, and he said he got a visa, but they wouldn't give one for my mom. because she didn't qualify. So he brought my mom back. My mother played a very central role in their escape. And my mother was quite a persuasive person. And I think quite beautiful, too. And so he brought her to the visa, and the guy changed his mind, and now they have two. In the passport, there's an initial visa to my father, which is crossed out. Another page. Anyhow. Now, my parents rushed to a boat leaving Yokohama for Vancouver the same day that they got this visa. And it was the last Japanese boat to arrive in Canada during the war. Prior to the war, there were 3 boats that went from Yokohama to Vancouver on a regular basis. They arrived in Vancouver on July. Okay, here they are on the boat to Vancouver. Hiamaru. Okay, so this is my mother over here, and this is my father. And these two, the Lichtenbaum brothers, were also on the boat who settled in Vancouver. So they arrived in Vancouver on July 9th, 1941, where they resided for the rest of their lives. So here is their being admitted to as a non-immigrant for the duration of the war in Vancouver, July 9th, 1941. My parents were deeply grateful to Japan and the Japanese people for their survival. They knew neither Sugihara's name nor of his heroism until the early 1970s. And once discovered, my father sent a letter of thanks to Chiune Sugihara, along with a gift of an Inuit sculpture, through the visit to Japan of a family friend. At my father's memorial service in 1986, an honorary tribute was dedicated to Chiune Sugihara. Now, 3 months later, Chiune Sugihara died. And on his way to the funeral, Nobuki Sugihara, his youngest son, born a few years after the war, passed through the Vancouver airport. He phoned my parents home during the layover, and my mother rushed to the airport and spent some time with Nobuki while he waited for his flight to Tokyo. This was the first of my family's many direct contacts with the Sugihara family. In July 1993, my sister Barbara and her husband Drew attended a dinner for Rhodes Scholars in Washington, D.C., put out by the British Embassy, because Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar, so they wanted to honor Rhodes Scholars, the British Embassy. During the dinner at the British Embassy, they sat at the same table as Bob Rae, then the Premier of Ontario, and his wife Arlene Pearlie Rae. By the way, Bob Cohen's family name was actually Cohen, if you go back generations. Anyhow, the Rays had recently visited Yukiko Sugihara during an official trip to Tokyo, and were organizing a dinner for the Sugiharas in Toronto involving the local Japanese and Jewish communities. 4 months later, in November 1993, Yukiko, eldest son Hiroki, and Hiroki's wife Michi stopped at the Vancouver airport on their way to Toronto. My mother, brother Bob, sister Barbara, myself, and our spouses greeted them at the airport, and we spent joyous hours with the Sugiharas. There was an outpouring of strong emotions. While Yukiko knew no English and we knew no Japanese, we felt deep respect for our Savior, valuing the essential role she played in her husband's decision to issue the visas. To me, Yukiko was an empress. So here's the picture at the airport at the time. That's Yukiko. That's her oldest son, Hiroki, and that's my sister Barbara, my mom, of course, and that's my brother Bob. My mother and sister attended the event in Toronto that was emceed by David Suzuki. And here's the event in Toronto with my mom and Yukiko and my sister Barbara there, and there's Hiroki, the oldest son. I don't know why, but all the pictures at Yukiko with other survivors, where my mother is present, she's always next to her, to Yukiko. I don't know why. In 1995, my mother and Barbara's family attended an event in San Francisco honoring Yukiko and Hiroki. The event, in fact, was the main organizer was the actor Edward Asner. My mother was one of the speakers. And here's a picture of again, of Yukiko, my mom, Hiroki, the oldest son, my sister Barbara, and Barbara's 3 children, Danielle, Sam, and Michael. Now, in 1996, the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center hosted a Sugihara exhibit. Hiroki attended the opening ceremony. My sister Barbara hosted a reception for Hiroki and known Sugihara descendants in Vancouver. And these descendants include 2 people you probably know in the local community. One is our current environment minister, George Heyman. The other is Jane Heyman, recently got the Order of Canada. She's very well known in the theater in British Columbia. And that's Hiroki, and this is the Kaplans, who were not on the Sugihara list. I'll discuss a little bit about how they got their visas later on. And my brother Bob, and my mother here. Okay, whoops, I'll go back here. My sister Barbara, now where did I put my briefcase? Oh, there it is, thank you. My sister Barbara wrote a memoir about my parents' escape to Canada. That was completed by her daughter Danielle and published in 2009 by Ronsdale Press. It's called I Have My Mother's Eyes. In 2012, I assisted Aya Takahashi, a Japanese freelance journalist editor based in Vancouver, who is passionate about the Sugihara story. I assisted her in the filming of 7 Sugihara descendant families in Vancouver. And here's a, whoops. Yeah, so here's a party for us all at my brother's place. And this is Aya Takahashi right over here. So here you see some families here. Takahashi includes Bayless, Alan Bayless over here. He was the Wall Street, he was a Wall Street journalist reporter here in Vancouver. Heyman, the Heymans I've showed you before, the Lermer and the Kaplans are in here too, and Zelko. The Kaplans and Zelko, when Sugihara had to leave his consulate, he stayed in a hotel in Kaunas. And at that hotel, he issued another 10 or 15 visas, and they included 2 families in Vancouver. Actually, 3 families in Vancouver, 2 Zelko families and the Kaplan family. And they were very lucky because they were not from Poland. They were from Memo, Lithuania. Now, why are they lucky? You see, once the Soviet Union annexed Lithuania, you could not leave. But Memo was German-occupied. So it was not part of Soviet Lithuania. So therefore, they were able to go through. In my first visit to Japan in May 2013, led by Aya, some of us attended the presentation ceremony of her films in the Sugihara Museum in Yaotsu, Chiune Sugihara's birthplace. We also gave talks about Sugihara to children at the local elementary school. So here's the children there in the school, in Sugihara's birthplace. And there's an interesting story behind this young lady who's Israeli, an Israeli girl. Because in Yaotsu, they invited, the Japanese paid for it, for an Israeli person to be there always. Not anymore, but at that time they had an Israeli person. And that's a daughter who learned Japanese, went to a Japanese school there. One of their children. We visited in the port of Suruga, Half of this display in its museum was devoted to Sugihara. Another half was the saving of a Polish orphanage in an earlier part of the century, and those he rescued. And it included a display panel featuring my sister's book, focusing on the page about my mother's description on their arrival in Suruga. Oops. Here we are. That's what's the display. It's in Japanese, and of course in the English in the book, and translated into Japanese. And it's about her comments about Suruga on arrival there. On my second visit to Japan, in November 2013, I spent 2 weeks giving lectures on my mathematical research. But I spent a joyous afternoon with 3 members of the Sugihara family. So this is the grandchildren, Chihiro and Madoka, the children of Hiroki. Hiroki was not alive anymore. And that's Michi, Hiroki's wife. That's the wife of the oldest son of Sugihara. While there, I gave 2 talks. They were requested talks about Sugihara. So I gave film talks. They were filmed about Sugihara at Keio University to Japanese businessmen with Israeli connections, and at the Tokyo University of Science. And in fact, the second talk was filmed by the Sugiharas themselves. A day was spent in Yokohama, including time spent with the Japanese reporter Tetsuya Enomoto. He had interviewed my mother in Vancouver for a book about Sugihara that he wrote with 5 colleagues. He showed me his interview diary pages from that time, and he loved her blueberry cake. In December 2013, Mr. Enomoto wrote an illustrated story about my family's connections with the Chiune Sugihara in his newspaper, Tokyo Shimbun. Unlike here, Japanese newspapers have millions of subscribers, even today. YouTubes were produced during my visit, available separately in Japanese and English. The one in Japanese has had about 300,000 views, titled George Bluman, The Story of a Jewish Family Saved by Sugihara Visas. In 2016, my wife Cynthia and I took a Caribbean cruise that included a stop in Curacao. And during a long chat with the curator of its Jewish museum, I learned that 2 Sugihara survivors actually reached Curacao. And in fact, on the Sugihara list, one of them I could identify as having a Curacao relation. I have twice visited the Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum as part of mathematical trips. As mentioned, Shanghai is where Sugihara survivors were transferred if unable to obtain exit visas from Japan to other destinations. After much coaxing, the museum forwarded me lists containing most of the 20,000 Jewish refugees admitted to Shanghai during the Holocaust period. About 19,000 of these came from Germany and Austria. My brother Bob and I are in regular contact with Madoka Sugihara, granddaughter of Chiune. She kindly forwarded me the fascinating pages of Chiune Sugihara's passport from 1937 until he left Kaunas to Berlin in September 1940. As I mentioned before, and I'll show it again, the very first entry is his obtaining a diplomatic visa. She asked me to interpret all the pages of the passport. I tried my best to do so. Now, in recent years, Sugihara's story has been receiving greater recognition in Canada. The Vancouver-based Wallenberg Sugihara Civil Courage Society has held an annual event since 2016 to honor BC individuals and groups who have exhibited risk-taking personal courage in defending human rights and helping others in trouble. The first winner was former BC Premier Ujjal Dosanjh. The Vancouver Maritime Museum, in commemorating 50 years of Vancouver and Yokohama as sister cities, had an exhibit about Sugihara and Vancouver connections to him that I assisted with. In 2021, as a keynote speaker, I participated in 2 programs on Sugihara, one initiated by Japan's ambassador to Canada and the other by the Toronto School Board for over 1,000 students and teachers in Ontario. In 2022, the Vancouver Fire Hall Arts Centre premiered a play by Manami Hara on Sugihara called Courage Now. And in last year, the Chutzpah Festival premiered a choral opera by Rita Ueda on connections between the Bluman and Sugihara families, called I Have My Mother's Eyes, a Holocaust memoir across generations. And there's going to be another performance. There were 2 performances in Gabriola Island and 2 in Vancouver, and there'll be a 5th performance in Tokyo on this coming December 1st. So here's the advertising about that. And Rita Ueda, I said, was the composer, and she's won a national award last year for her compositions. In September this year, I had the tremendous pleasure of meeting a granddaughter of Tadeusz Romer, Irena Strazik, who lives in Vancouver and is present here today. Irena is right over here, right over here. And as I mentioned, there are about 600 of those who received Sugihara visas. That's about 30% of those who survived who owe their destinations due to her grandfather. If my parents had not gotten the visa to come to Canada through her grandfather, they would have gone to Shanghai, for sure. Because they went in the last boat that was able to leave. Next year, we'll premiere a documentary about the descendants of those saved by Sugihara as a follow-up to the award-winning film called The Rescuers by Michael King and narrated by Martin Gilbert. About 3-4 months ago, it had a special showing in the U.S. Congress. My brother and Bob and I will appear in this segment about Sugihara. He came to Vancouver to interview. He's gone all over the world, Michael King, to interview people for about 6 or 7 news shows about rescuers of Jews during the war. And believe it or not, the final touch-ups of this series will be done in Vancouver. Okay. There are many museums dedicated to the heroics of Chiune Sugihara, including museums in Kaunas, Lithuania, Suruga, Yautsu, Nagoya, and the Chiune Sugihara Semple Museum that opened in Tokyo 4 years ago. Members of my family were honored to be the only Sugihara descendants invited to the opening. Now, here I'm showing a picture of Irena. If you can't see her, this is Irena over here with me. Okay. Here is the opening ceremony of the museum in March. And I was quite honored to be invited to be one of the speakers there here. And this is Chihiro, the grandson of Sugihara. This is the Israeli ambassador. And these are various ambassadors from Poland, Lithuania, Netherlands, and deputy ambassadors from Canada and the United States. And here was also a picture of my family members who attended. That was myself, my brother Bob, Michael, my nephew Nigel, and his wife Molly. They live in Washington. This is Madoka's husband, late husband. And this is Madoka and Chihiro, the grandchildren. And these are the great-grandchildren, Kei and Oriha Sugihara. Oriha is now doing a set of films on those whose descendants for those who were saved by Sugihara. Now, oops, there are many museums. Okay, we loaned our passport for display at the museum that is now closed temporarily, the one in Tokyo. Now, Jan Kagan, the designer of the lighting for the original London and Broadway musicals, Les Miserables and Miss Saigon and many others, for the London and Broadway stages, is now redesigning the Holocaust Museum in Kaunas, Lithuania. Kaunas, Lithuania was the 2022 cultural capital of Europe for that year, and she designed the program for the city. And she's quite a lady. And we've had, since the beginning of this year, we've been having lots of back and forth emails and Zoom calls with each other. Because she intends to focus on the Bluman family in the redesign of the museum. She feels that we should focus on people rather than events in a museum. Now, on my UBC website, these are first of all, before I go on, these are the various museums emphasizing the heroics of Chiune Sugihara in Japan. So on my UBC website, and this is the preamble on the website, I document information about those issued Sugihara visas in Lithuania, including their estimated age in 1940, when they got the visa, prior occupation, when known, family relationships, if they arrived in Japan or Shanghai, their eventual country of destination, whether they were aided by Tadeusz Romer, and those who apparently perished. So this is a monstrous amount of work, I can tell you that. I keep updating it and get emails and correspondence from people around the world. And I've made many interesting friends through doing this. So here's on my website, the latest version, and this is based on the numbered list of Sugihara. But here you see the names, the ages, the occupation, relationships, other family members that were involved with the visas, whether they went to Japan or not, whether they went to Shanghai, and their destination, that is their initial destination. Many changed countries later on. And if we don't have much information, I try to find out where they were born in Poland. So maybe somebody can help out. So people keep on adding to this for me. So I try best to update as possible. There are for sure many errors. So I have it both by the Sugihara number, but I thought more important would be the alphabetical ordering of those. So this is an alphabetical ordering with their Sugihara number listed over here. Okay. Now, in red, I indicate those that were helped by Romer. It's due to Romer they were able to go to those countries. Sugihara's heroism and role in saving my parents is a family story that we have subsequently shared with our children and grandchildren. And Chiune Sugihara is commemorated annually at our Passover Seder. My younger grandson is named Ari Sempo Bluman. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing so much about your family and the incredible story of Sugihara. I just wanted to say I've been thinking about your talk in terms of us doing this on Sukkot when we traditionally invite different guests, and imagine who would we invite to our sukkah for a meal, like the ushpizin. And I think Sugihara would be an amazing person to have at our sukkah. So thank you so much for sharing your story.
Welcome.
Do we have time for a few questions?
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Okay, I'll come around for a few questions. And as we do, Annika, you're here. Has a quick announcement that I'm not going to forget to do. Okay.
George, a couple questions. How long did Mr. Sugihara live in Kobe? Because
he wasn't in Kobe.
Sorry?
Sugihara was not in Kobe.
Oh, he didn't?
No. So Sugihara after the war went to Tokyo. And then he left Tokyo. He went there from 1947 to 1960. And then he went to Moscow for 16 years. And then he came back for the last 10 years of his life to Tokyo.
The other small question is, have you ever told your story to Sugihara's story to the Nikkei Place Foundation?
Which foundation?
Nikkei Place Foundation. Nikkei.
Nikkei.
The Japanese community.
I've been there. As a matter of fact, I made a special visit to the Nikkei Museum. And I told them I could give a presentation there, and they were thinking about it, but they decided not to have a presentation. No.
On the board.
Yeah, no, they decided not to.
Talk to them.
Thanks very much, George. I want to begin my question just by saying this is not the very first time that Sugihara has been the subject of a talk here at Temple Sholom. Many years ago, in this very room, Nadia Kaplan, the mother of Nomi Kaplan and mother-in-law of Jerry Groh, gave a talk about her experience of surviving the Holocaust, and that was partly very much due to a Sugihara visa. And I can add that although I don't believe your fondly remembered mother ever gave a formal talk at Temple Sholom, she often talked about Sugihara. But I want to thank you for adding to the list and enhancing what we know about Sugihara. My question is this, and it's something you and I have talked about at times, but I'll keep the question very simple. It took a long time for Sugihara to become really well known as a Holocaust rescuer. And there are different reasons for that. For one, we do know that people in Japan have welcomed the opportunity to have a Japanese person seen so positively in connection with the events around World War II. But we also know that survivors and survivor families played a role. In your assessment, which of these factors played the biggest role in making the Sugihara story become known after many years in which it was hardly known about?
Well, it started about 1968 when attaché to the Israeli embassy in Tokyo his family were Sugihara survivors, and so he asked about Sugihara. They didn't know who he was, and so he made the contact. So it really started there with an Israeli attaché. But then the story, it really became prominent under the prime ministership of Abe. Abe promoted Sugihara to the embarrassment of the Sugihara family, because they felt that he was using it too much to blemish the record in the war, you see. But there was a survey in a Japanese magazine a few years ago, and it rated Sugihara as the most important Japanese person in history of Japan. But if you look on other website of Japan, he's considered one of the 50 most important individuals in Japanese history. Everyone in Japan knows him when I bump into them.
Hello, my name is...
Before I forget, I want to say, there are many school books. I want to mention that. I've looked at about 30 school books in Japan that talk about the Sugihara story. Yeah. Yes.
Hello, thanks for coming. I was one of the docents for the first exhibit of Sugihara, and it was your mother who really brought the whole issue. I think it was after she met in in Japan or whatever. She was so full of emotions. Me and your mother were members of ORT, and we were in charge of the culture. And through the time that we were planning this thing, she was dropping here and there all kind of stories about it. Eventually, I joined the film festival, the Jewish Film Festival, and we brought the film. It was unforgettable, more than anything, not only for the Jews, but so many Japanese who never heard about it came in to see the film. I think what your mother added is so much texture. One thing that was not mentioned, we put a big exhibit about him himself, and apparently he was part of this very unique group of Japanese that are supposed to use the sword. I forget how you call it, harakiri?
Samurai.
I think that not the name of it, but this is a group that's noted for their bravery, and it was going for 1,000 years, I think, and he was part of it. So he thought that it's his duty to really fit this kind of title, and for that reason he told your mother that he felt it's his duty. I get very emotional about it because it was, we think of Japanese as such cold and feeling. Well, this was not the case, and your mother brought the best part of that from Sugi. I'm sorry, I'm getting older.
Yeah. You're very welcome.
I did a great deal.
I think I may have to make a correction, though. I don't think the samurai story is necessarily correct. You see, Sugihara, that was not his original name. His father changed the name to be more distinguished. So I think he came from a more ordinary background, in fact. But I'm not sure. But I've not been able to see any verification of this. Even with I've many times talked to the family, never heard any verification from the family.
Thank you. So if people have other questions, they can ask you, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Before I forget, we had one quick announcement from Annika. That is unrelated, and then we will conclude.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. I just wanted to tell you that for many, many years, Sisterhood through Myra Elson has been leading wonderful hikes on a Sunday, maybe 10 times a year, 9 times. Walks, sorry, not hikes, walks. Mainly in the endowment land, and after many, many years, Myra decided this spring to retire. And since I was coming back to the city, I needed something to do. So I have agreed to lead these. I did put a walk out. Sorry, I used to hike for a living, so forget me. I put it out in the September newsletter, but I had no shows, no phone calls, so there was something not quite right. So for now, I will do a walk on November the 10th at 11 o'clock. For 1 hour at the most. So you'll see an announcement in the newsletter, so please keep looking. My phone number will be there. Call me if there's something else you want to do, or something less, or another area of the city. Thank you.
Thank you, Annika. So if you want to join for a walk, contact her. And to conclude again, thank you so much, George, for coming and for sharing your story and your family's story with us. It was really, really meaningful. And again, if you have questions, you can come and ask. And I wish everyone a happy rest of your Sukkot and great rest of your week. Thank you all so much.